defined our components of impulse. We've talked a little bit about how to get into the scale of intelligence. We've talked about the silent communication type, and this is the intimate communication type, which deals with intimate interaction, which is having a sort of foundation to communicate from. And then we talked about the dynamic between intimate identity and intimate orientation, and then how this eventually needs to kind of stop or break down, and you kind of have to back your way sort of out of it. So we've introduced our Z0 scale, first, second, and third characteristics, and then this is what's going to describe our fourth, fifth, and sixth characteristics. So to continue with the R scale, we have to kind of just push forward. Whenever we mentioned the dynamic in a constructive intimacy, and we mentioned sort of backing away from it, there are actually a few different things you can do. But if you go back through silent communication and then back into intimate communication, that's totally fine. But to continue talking about what else happens, you have to consider moving all the way back out of silent communication and then kind of going somewhere else. So unfortunately, it's not as exactly as linear as it may seem. So what we have to do is get back to this sort of slanting part where we're between utilizing intelligence versus going back into impulse and so forth. But the other thing that you can do after you have gone through this entire process is make a decision. And one of those decisions is to continue to communicate for the sake of the greater good. And that is a separate communication type, which is this bar right here. And that's referred to as social communication. And there's a slightly different explanation for how that works. In theory, it's handled by a different area of the brain, and for that reason, the process is somewhat different than going from sort of most simple to kind of maximum activation, and then sort of back again. And in order to do that, we have to back out of intimate communication, we have to back out of silent communication, we kind of have to loop around. And once we loop around to here, we utilize or start opening the capacity for social communication. So one thing that is important to note is the way that we determine or number the characteristics when it comes to social communication. So in the previous ones, we have first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth characteristics. We have the dynamic between fifth and sixth, and then we kind of go 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we have to kind of loop ourselves all the way around. And when we start in social communication, we end up starting at the maximum rather than building up and going back down. We start at the maximum and we get more specific from there. So the trend in numbering changes from silent and intimate. It changes whenever you move over to social communication. And social communication begins with the 9th characteristic of communication. That's the first social characteristic that we get. And from there it goes to the 8th, and then to the 7th characteristic. So these are going to be the characteristics that are involved in social communication. So the way that we name these is very similar. You know, we'll use social to sort of determine our communication type, and the first characteristic that we have in social communication is going to be our social identity. So the social identity in a representative sense is a separation from individuality. Our social identity is something that is measured by our environmental experience. It's measured by the things that you're aware of beyond your individual self. It's the things that have happened in the environment that you've applied meaning to, and the magnitude of that is going to be equivalent to your social identity. There are some more philosophical ways to think about them in terms of how much information you can really determine. You know, there are specific amount of information to be known in the world in a physical sense. And the more of that you're aware of, the larger your social identity, the larger magnitude of your social identity. But it has nothing to do with who you are as an individual per se. It deals with what you're aware of beyond yourself. Which, with that being said, people have different magnitudes of social identity. So sometimes you can consider all that information out there, the fabric of space-time and the universe and all that stuff, multiverses and that kind of thing. But other people, their social identity may only extend to the galaxy and a certain number of stars. Some people may only be aware of the planets. Some people may know that the sun comes up in the morning and goes down at night, if you're in that type of place. And other people don't really have an identity besides who they are with their family life and in their career and stuff. Other people don't have a social identity beyond their own individual selves. So the extent to which you can separate yourself from yourself is the measure of your social identity. And that is sort of the kind of balloon term for what you're aware of in the environment, beyond yourself as an individual. And that's kind of the maximum separation, or a proportional separation, kind of appropriate separation of who you are in terms of your internalizations and that kind of thing. And that is essentially the measure of the social identity. And to do that, you have to separate yourself from the internalizations, you have to separate yourself from the one-on-one dynamic and so forth in order to really consider that amount of information. So from there, you kind of have the maximum kind of consideration. From there, we get to something that exists within that awareness, and that's referred to as the social orientation. And that is kind of like an item. It's kind of like an idea. It's an object. It's a collection of information that any other person with a appropriate social identity can also experience. So, any item, whiteboard, for example, or marker, is the item that the other people, any other given person, is able to put their attention on and focus on. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with anything with me as an individual. It's just something that exists in the environment that you can put focus on. And any person who has the capacity to experience that can also put their attention there. And from there, you can communicate about it. You can interpret something about it. And doing that is part of what you refer to as a social interaction. And in the social interaction, you have some interpretation of that item. So if you think of a marker, for example, you can recognize that this thing is truly termed a marker. But in a different language, it may be called something else. A person, or maybe a child, or anyone who has never seen or used one, they may not have an interpretation of that. So there are two kind of terminal points for the social interaction. And it's kind of similar to the thing that happens in intimacy, in that dynamic, where you have some kind of experience and you have to interpret whether it was a positive or negative thing. With the social interaction, you have to figure out whether or not you have applied meaning to that before. So let's say a person recognizes this sort of object as a marker. That would be considered a positive social interaction. Whereas someone who has no idea what this object is, they would say, I don't know what that is. I can't apply meaning to it. I can't recognize what the significance of that thing is. That would be kind of a negative, a negative interpretation or a negative social interaction. And that essentially describes how social information is communicated. And to begin with, you have sort of separation from yourself and the kind of big picture. Then you point to something that becomes the focus of the communication, and then you interpret something about that thing. And that's sort of the way that you move through social communication. So you have the 9th characteristic, which is referred to as social identity, the 8th characteristic, which is social orientation, or the item or the collection of information that's important in that sort of environment. And then you have some interpretation of that thing. And it's either a positive or negative interpretation. And the only thing that's important is whether or not you recognize it, how you feel about it, and what it means to you. And all that stuff has nothing to do with social communication. In order to consider that, you have to kind of go all the way back around again and consider what that means to you as an individual, how it's going to influence your livelihood, your survival, and so on. And then you have to think about whether that entire thing is important enough to communicate with somebody, and then through that you kind of have your own meaning applied to it and so on. So all that is completely different. The only thing that's important in social communication is whether or not you recognize something. And the tendency for people who communicate through social interaction is to determine people's values, their meaningfulness, their inclusion in the group, based on whether they recognize things. That's sort of what standard theory implies, is that when it comes to talking to any group of people, whether it's one person to a couple people, whether it's one person to hundreds or even thousands of people, the only thing that really matters is whether or not you recognize what's going on. And sometimes you are really involved because you recognize it, and sometimes you're really intrigued because you don't know what is really happening. So the thing that becomes important is how well, as an audience member or as somebody who's interpreting what's going on, is whether or not you're familiar with that thing. And that essentially defines what social communication is about. So you have sort of the maximum separation in identity, you have the focal point of the communication, and then you interpret that. And so you interpret something about that focal point in one way or another. And that's essentially the dynamic that goes along with that communication type. So that's characteristics 9, 8, and 7. Now, after adding social communication, we've essentially gotten through the entire thinking type of horizontal thinking. So just to kind of recap, a little bit of a review, these first 3 communication types, these first 3 bars were all labeled A previously, and this entire label right here was horizontal thinking, which is all part of the R scale. So in the R scale, there's horizontal thinking, and there are 3 different communication types. There's silent communication, there's intimate communication, and there's social communication. So if we go back through this, we have our unit defined by the Z0 scale. We have all the prerequisites to get into intelligence. In the scale of intelligence, we have this thinking type, which is horizontal thinking. Within horizontal thinking, we have 3 communication types. So we have silent communication, which is right here, intimate communication right here, and social communication, which is right here. And silent communication deals with the first, second, and third characteristics. That's silent identity, silent interaction, silent orientation. And in intimate communication, we deal with characteristics 4, 5, and 6. And that's intimate interaction, intimate identity, and intimate orientation. And then social communication, we go from 9 to 8 to 7, and that's social identity, social orientation, social interaction. And those collectively are going to define horizontal thinking. So anytime we need to refer to one of these processes, when we're referring to communicating with the self and creating our internalizations, or we need to refer to communicating one-on-one with somebody, or when we need to communicate from one individual to any number of people, we refer to that entire process that's essentially based on the individual as horizontal thinking. That's sort of the reason that we group those together. Each one of these has a fundamental basis in the individual. Individual to self, individual to one other individual, and individual to group. So each one of these are based on individual internalizations. It's based on one person and is directed either at that one person to themselves, that one person one-on-one, or that one person to the group. So that's sort of the reason that they're all grouped together under horizontal thinking, is they're all based on the individual. And that defines that thinking type and these first three communication types, and those are the specific characteristics that are associated with it. So if you can learn to recognize when a person is displaying one of those things, the same way you can recognize a symptom or what have you, then you can get a better idea of what they may be going through. And you can determine why something may be happening differently than it should. You may be able to determine how to get that person to the next step, or whatever may serve your purpose at that time. But that is horizontal thinking in the scale of intelligence. And to continue, we'll get into the other two thinking types and the communication types that go with those. So now that we've defined horizontal thinking through silent, intimate, and social communication, we're going to move on to the next one, which is a different thinking type and a different communication type. So the thinking type that we're going to discuss is orthogonal thinking. And orthogonal thinking has a dynamic that is a little bit different than just the individual and just based on the individual to other people. So orthogonal thinking has one communication type, and that communication type is called shared communication. And the dynamic that is sort of the definition of shared communication is individuals learning from one another. So in horizontal thinking, all of the internalizations were from the individual. In shared communications, the internalizations are happening and being connected between ideas of individuals. So it's kind of difficult to really explain, but it's essentially the process of taking an idea, taking another idea, and making a connection between them. But instead of that happening in your own mind only, you may notice another person has an idea, then you notice that you have an idea as well, and then you make a connection based on the relationship with that person. And the idea that that connection being shared between people is the dynamic of shared communication. And that's extremely important in learning, that's extremely important in social learning, and those kinds of things. And there are two primary parties that are involved in that. And one person is going to have a little more understanding, and the other person is going to be interpreting that understanding. So the way that we refer to those are, those different parties are aversive party as well as subversive party. So the aversive party is going to sort of lead the way. They're going to have an idea to begin with, and they're going to make some kind of observation or provide some kind of information. And then the subversive party is going to observe that, and they're going to come up with their own idea based on the other person's interpretation of the world. So if you think back to the kind of overview, one thing that was mentioned is that shared communication deals with a range of characteristics. And the reason is because the information that's being combined or is having those connections made between them are happening between individuals. It's based on the relationship that they have. So you end up with a range of communication, which is 10 characteristics through 17 characteristics. And there's a little more theory that has to be explained to really talk about why each of these parties are there. But essentially what we're assuming is that the aversive party is no longer communicating directly to the other person. For whatever reason, either intimacy has kind of broken down, or they're no longer worried about who they are individually. They've separated themselves from their individuality. And the way that we describe that is by assigning everything that they're talking about in terms of providing information as being part of their social identity. And in social communication, that identity is the 9th characteristic of communication. So we just assume that they have that amount of consideration taking place. And the dynamic that's happening is that the subversive party is considering whatever the aversive party is communicating about the aversive party's social identity. And once they consider that, the subversive party has a few options. And essentially what they're trying to do is fill in the gaps. And they're trying to get their own understanding of whatever the aversive party is saying. And the thing that's going to happen is that the subversive party is going to choose a characteristic. If you think about the horizontal thinking on the subversive party's individual level, they have the option of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, ninth, eighth, or seventh characteristics. That's kind of their option. They're going to hear what the other person is saying, and they're going to try to internalize that information in a way that fills in one of these gaps. So the aversive party always is going to have the responsibility of the 9th characteristic. Doesn't matter what's going on. The aversive party has separated themselves from the individual. They're leading everything, and they're stepping away from their individuality in order to interpret something about the social world, about something that's out there. That's the definition of what the aversive party is doing. So from there, the subversive party, the party that's learning, is going to determine what about that information has meaning to it. And if we start from 17 and work our way back, we can think about what happens every time we compare that characteristic to whatever the aversive party is going for. And the reason that this range is defined at 17 instead of 18 is if you think about the social orientation of the subversive party, that means that they're just comparing their orientation to their orientation. That's kind of a one-on-one thing, and you have to go through a whole other set of steps for that. So for that reason, we don't really consider that to be an option. At that point, you're just comparing social orientations. You're comparing social identities. But if you compare social orientation to whatever the aversive party is, what you can consider is a composition of information. So now you end up with a little math problem. You have the aversive party's 9th characteristic plus, this is just plus whatever consideration is happening in the subversive party. And if you remember, in our faculty of intelligence, we have the entire dynamic being one idea that's being reactivated. We have another idea that's being reactivated, and we're making a connection between those. That's the entire dynamic of intelligence. So that's basically what's happening here with this process, but instead of just drawing a line between them, we're going to say that we're adding them together. And the term that standard theory uses to refer to that is a composition. The term that you use to define this is a characteristic, and then whenever you're adding between people in an indirect way, in orthogonal thinking or shared communication, it's referred to as a composition. And that composition is happening between people, and what you get as a result is a cycle characteristic. And that cycle characteristic is essentially representative of the idea that is shared in that relationship. So that's the magnitude of communication that happens in that relationship. But you can do that with any of these. You can do that with, the aversive party is always going to have 9 characteristics. And let's say the subversive party is going to consider that whatever they said influences, whatever the aversive party said will influence the subversive party's intimate identity. It influences how they interpret some kind of event about themselves. So if you have 9 plus 5, you end up with 14 characteristics of communication, or 14 cycle characteristics, however you like to determine that. And you can do that with any of these, except with 9. But 9, you can also do 9 plus 1, that's 10, and so on. The other thing we can do in a completely standard sense is name those characteristics. So if you remember back into horizontal thinking, where all these are kind of based, the first characteristic is called a silent identity. The 6th characteristic is called the intimate orientation. The 8th characteristic is called the social orientation. So if you want to try to name these, what you will have is going to be defined by the subversive party's contribution to this. So to refer to that, you would have, in this example of 9 plus 8, for example, you would have a shared social orientation. And that's how you can define what 17 characteristics of communication is designed to be. But you can only do that if you're considering the absolute standard normal only. And that's something that will change if you're going through something abnormal. There are sort of abnormal processes that can happen here as well. But if you want to define everything in the complete absolute normal way, you can refer to this one, 9 plus 5, as a shared intimate identity. And in 9 plus 1, you can refer to that as a shared self or shared silent identity. And that's how you can name each individual characteristic that way. So you'd have a shared silent identity, shared silent interaction, shared silent orientation, shared intimate interaction, shared intimate identity, and shared intimate orientation. You'd have a shared social orientation and a shared social interaction. And those describe the dynamic that happens between those individuals. But once again, these are only looking at aversive party, which is one individual, to subversive party, which is another individual. There can be multiple subversive parties, but each subversive party is going to have to result in their own individual determination of that. So even though they're listening to the same, if there are multiple subversive parties, even though they're listening to the same aversive information, one subversive party can think of that as the 5th characteristic of communication, while another subversive party can associate that with their 2nd or 1st characteristic, and so forth. So the definition of which cycle of communication is being displayed is going to be based on what the subversive party is interpreting in relation to what the aversive party is providing. So that's essentially the dynamic that describes shared communication, and that's the reason there's a range of characteristics, and it all depends on this relationship. It all depends on who's kind of doing the leading and who has separated themselves from individuality versus a person that's learning and is considering that information in order to fill in the gaps in horizontal thinking. So there is one other thing that is worth noting, and it's another difference between horizontal thinking and orthogonal thinking. So horizontal thinking is very direct, and it follows a specific set of specific path, and you kind of go from lowest activation to highest activation, and you kind of work stair step your way up. And it's sort of like that in social communication as well, where you start kind of really far out there and get more specific, but you kind of stair step, and you have to take the steps as they come. You have to go through all of the energy required for each one of those, and it can be very taxing. But if you notice in orthogonal thinking or indirect communication or shared communication, you can kind of jump around. You know, every time the aversive party offers a interpretation of something, you can jump around from you know, the seventh characteristic to the fourth to the first, sixth, wherever. And the thing that's happening is that you're just sort of filling in the gaps. You're kind of patchworking in whatever you find meaning, whatever happens to, you know, to resonate or ring true to you with the aversive party. So the only thing you're really doing is considering things. You're not having to build on them. You're not having to follow the steps and expend all the energy. So instead of it being kind of a slow climb all the way up to maximum, you're kind of just tapping and you know, going from here to there. So the thing that really defines that is just the composition, just kind of that plus sign. So you can utilize this sort of just composition much more easily than you could the true creation of characteristics as it is in horizontal thinking. Horizontal thinking takes way more energy when compared to orthogonal thinking, because all you're doing is just you know, kind of flipping the switch back and forth. You're not necessarily building stuff up. You're not holding on to all that consideration. You're not necessarily getting that overload and all that stuff. You're just kind of comparing and contrasting. So it's a little different. It's just the process of combining ideas rather than combining and building up and so on. It's sort of just the impulse of doing that. So it's much less taxing, as it were. It makes it a lot easier to learn. And that's one of the reasons that experiencing intelligence from the lowest threshold can be very difficult, because you learn from people, you learn from your family, you learn from friends and coworkers, and you're part of a group and so on. And it takes much less energy to just, you know, consider this, consider that, consider this, consider that. And then the only time you really have to build upon that and sort of solidify it is when you get to the point where you're ready to communicate that directly to someone. And that leads to another problem of being able to really interpret meaning as an individual without worrying about relationships and without worrying about all that stuff. So to represent that, there's a process called decomposition. So when we're adding these together, we're kind of referring to that as composition. But you can also decompose these ideas, and in a very standard sense, it's extremely easy. You know, all you have to do is remove one of these two things. So if you're looking at what the subversive party is trying to deal with, you would just subtract that aversive party's interpretation of that thing. So let's say we know that there's some kind of 17 characteristic. We're going to subtract the aversive party, and we'll end up with the subversive party's consideration. And same with any of these. Let's say we have 15. This is probably an abnormal sense, but 15 minus the aversive party, we end up with the characteristic of 6, which is the social orientation. But that is much more important when you have abnormal things going on. You know. So anyway, the same way you can compose these ideas, you can decompose these ideas to try to figure out, you know, where they're sourced from and so forth. But that's usually when you're dealing with someone who has a belief that's based on a relationship, but they're not really able to communicate it very well, and then maybe it leads to some kind of behavioral problem or some kind of mood change or something like that. You can consider, okay, well, there's somebody else in that relationship that the other part of that cycle characteristic is sort of associated with. So if you want to consider what's going on there, you kind of consider, okay, maybe that person is no longer part of this, you know, communication or whatever, and you can kind of determine how deeply seated or, you know, where that idea or that relationship is influencing them. So the same way that we can compose ideas just using the idea of consideration, we can also just decompose those ideas by kind of inverting that. That's kind of the same thing, you know, impulsing. and compression and so on. But once again, all that is still related to our unit and our components of impulse. It's just sort of the way that they're displayed, and that's just another way to sort of keep track of the information that's being kind of moved around within that relationship. So at this point, we've gone through horizontal thinking with the 3 communication types: silent, intimate, and social. And then we've gone through orthogonal thinking with the shared communication type. So to continue on, we will introduce the 3rd thinking type, which is absolute thinking and supersocial communication. Okay, now we're ready to deal with the final thinking type here, which is absolute thinking, and the communication type within absolute thinking is supersocial communication. So supersocial communication is related to groups of ideas. So if we think about the other thinking types, in horizontal thinking, everything was about the individual. In orthogonal thinking, everything was about a relationship between 2 parties, the aversive and subversive party. So in supersocial, what we're dealing with are multiple people and multiple ideas. So that's really important for things like politics and for rules and law, policies and operating procedures and that kind of thing. But supersocial communication is how people handle groups of ideas. And there are specific characteristics that define that. So I'll go ahead and write down the characteristics that we're going to be dealing with. The first one's 25, the second one's 27, and then 54, and after that 117. So this 25th characteristic of communication is a special case, and this is referred to as 3-party shared intimacy. That's the simplest example of the need for supersocial communication. And essentially, what you're trying to do is make connections when there are more people than you can really handle dealing with. Instead of there just being one idea being activated, another idea being activated, and then making a connection between those. In supersocial communication, all of a sudden, you have another idea. There's another person. There's another object, another consideration, and at that point, you are stuck at 25 characteristics of communication. You're stuck between which of these connections to make. Should there be the original connection? Should there be a connection that goes from the first one to the new one? Should there be a connection that goes from the second one to the new one? What are you supposed to do? So the entire dynamic of supersocial communication is how to solve that problem. And in 3-party shared intimacy, you realize that for whatever reason, just making one connection here isn't enough because there's something that's not considered. There's something kind of outside of that problem. So this is kind of like the lower limit of supersocial communication. And if you try to solve that problem using horizontal thinking or orthogonal thinking, you're gonna end up with something else. And since we've already mentioned composition, if you subtract a supersocial, if you subtract a social identity from this, you get 25 minus 9. That's going to leave you with 16. If you subtract 9 from that, you end up with 7. If you subtract 9 with that, you kind of go too far. So it doesn't really resolve the way that you would expect a normal complete cycle of communication to their incongruent parts going on there. So in order to solve that problem, we have to consider more information. And to do that, we handle that using these cycle characteristics of communication. And they also have a name the same way that all the other ones are named. And the 27th characteristic of communication is a supersocial identity. And this is a point where you have recognized that you can't make a congruent connection between those, and you consider that there are multiple things going on. And you're essentially coming to terms with the fact that you're comparing more information than what's normally possible. So in a supersocial identity, the way to think about it in a absolutely congruent sense is that you just have three ideas that you have to try to make sense of. And the reason that these are numbered the way that they are, the reason that there's that trend, is you can think of very generally each one of these as a social identity. So you can think of each dot representing a 9 characteristic of information, that magnitude of information. And you can kind of assume that they're all kind of congruent. And what you have to do is try to figure out which ones need to be grouped and which ones need to be sorted out. So if you group them, you're kind of composing them together, you're kind of adding them up. And if you sort them out, you're removing one of those from the consideration. So in order to do that, you have to figure out how closely related they are. And the case that we'll consider is that they are all very closely related. It's not really easy to say which one is which. It's not easy to say how different they are or how similar they are. So for that reason, you have to use some other method of sorting in order to solve that problem. And to do that, we have to, what you consider, group that information. And that means that you consider more things about them. You try to get more information out of them. And doing that is part of something called the supersocial interaction. And that's where you have to compare those things. You have to not only compare the original information that you're dealing with, but you also have to compare something along with it. And we'll just add this bar here to kind of determine, what may be considerable within that, and you can think of that as like a length maybe, or a specific distance between another idea or what have you. But what you're trying to figure out is how well each one of these fits. So maybe, this one fits in well with one type of idea, and this one fits in well with another type of idea. But for whatever reason, this one in the center is different. Right? At that point, we've basically solved our problem. This one is similar, this one on the other end is similar, but the one in the middle is different. And if we do that, then we've solved our interaction. We've figured out what needs to happen. And the whole purpose of doing this is trying to sort out what's different. And if we go back to orthogonal thinking, we can think of grouping and sorting the same way as we do composing and decomposing. So if we just decide to decompose this process, now all of a sudden we have these two things to compare. Now all of a sudden we know that this identity here is not something we need to figure out. Now we can compare these one-on-one, or we can see how closely related they are. Maybe what we thought was a 9 characteristic, a 9 characteristic, 9 characteristic, maybe it was 9 and 8, or something like that. Maybe it was 9 and 7. But now we can solve that between individuals. We don't have to use all these different groups and stuff like that. We can see what the original problem actually was. We can see what was going on in that relationship, and we can solve this need to sort out all this additional information using a more conducive set of rules, where it's just comparing things directly. And that's essentially what happens when we group, and then we sort, and then we sort. So that's one way that we can move through there. But there's some other things we can do. And that's kind of what happens when these still look pretty similar. So this still kind of has that sort of idea there. And that's still pretty similar. And this is also fairly similar. So it's not necessarily readily apparent which one of these we need to choose over the other. And once we do that, we essentially group all of those again and consider even more information. And when we group them again, we move to sort of higher level of activation, a higher level of consideration, and we get to this part here, this third step, which is called the supersocial orientation. And at the supersocial orientation, a few things are going on. So if you look at the pattern here, from when you group from the identity to interaction, you're about doubling. But when you go from interaction to orientation, you're doubling and then some. So not only are you getting all of these similar kind of considerations, you also have to come up with something that ties all that together. And one way to think about it is by composing this with like a shape. You know, it could be a triangle, a square, it could be a dot, but there's double and then an additional amount of consideration. And this is going to encode whatever this pattern happens to be. The same way that we're encoding information between two ideas in the other thinking types, we're trying to use this to encode whatever this relationship is, to say that we recognize whatever's similar there. So what happens in reality is that we run into a problem. We run into our limit. We run into more information that we can consider. And the way that standard theory describes that is through something called the gap. And the gap is a phenomenon that is sort of dictated through neurochemistry, through our physical kind of limitations. And that happens beyond 117. So beyond 117, down here somewhere, we have 118 characteristics of communication, and that's called the gap. So functionally what's going to happen is if you get to the point where you're comparing all that information and you don't have an additional consideration, then you kind of go over the edge. You don't know how to resolve that problem, and you continually try to resolve it, and you kind of go over the edge. And that leads to the gap. That leads to a physiological response that will prevent the brain from continually trying to solve that problem. And there are some reasons why it happens. There are some reasons why we can't just consider that. It has to do with compressing that information. It has to do with neurochemistry. It has to do with the physiological aspects of the brain. But for whatever reason, instead of trying to store this information, the brain is going to say, slow down. It's going to say, take a couple steps back and do something else. You have to come back around to figure out the relationship between those. But if we do know something about that, then all we have to say is that we recognize this pattern, but instead of looking at this pattern, we're going to look at the thing that relates them. We're going to look at the law that describes what's going on between those. We're going to look at the rule or the policy, and this essentially is just going to be considered one of these things. We're not going to worry about what's actually contained in there. We're going to relate this and sort of flip it over to be whatever the rule is, whatever the law is, whatever the procedure is. It's going to be whatever is set aside and is predetermined to handle that problem. And that is the only way that you're truly able to achieve a supersocial orientation, is if you've been through that whole process and you've realized that there's too much going on and you have to have some kind of end game to it. That's the reason we have things like rules and laws and so on and so forth. So instead of trying to compare all this information, you can recognize, okay, there's a rule that describes whatever is happening right here. There's a law that tells us which one of these is important. You know, there's some kind of procedure that tells us what to do when that amount of chaos is happening. So without having something in place like that, you hit the gap. And the gap is going to force you out of intelligence. It's going to cause you to slow everything down, and it's going to push you into the next scale over, which is the Z scale. So in the standard sense, you really have to have a need to compare multiple identities. You have to, and that's the supersocial identity. You have to figure out how those work together in the supersocial interaction, and then you have to decide how those are related if needed. If there's still enough going on that you have to figure that out, then you use a supersocial orientation in order to determine what to do with that information. And similarly, what you can do is group information and then sort information, and then group and then group and then sort and then group and then sort and then sort and then so on. And that will allow you to essentially figure out what the best plan of action is or what the best thing to do is. So those are the primary ways that you move in between the characteristics. If you think back to horizontal thinking, you kind of just stair your way up. You know, you kind of just move up and get maximum and back again. In orthogonal thinking, you kind of pick and choose. And then in absolute thinking, you group and sort and group and sort and sort and group and so on. Along with that, you can also modify these things. So what you can do is instead of considering a group of information, you can consider specific aspects of them. So instead of considering the entire group of stuff, you just add a condition to one of these things. So you think of maybe one of these, and instead of it being kind of equivalent to all that, you add a little bit of weight to one of them. So let's say this first one here, you also have an additional consideration here. So now they're not as congruent. You know, now there's something else going on, and the way that I'm going to just sort of stylize this is saying that we're moving this way, so we're moving closer to sorting them out, meaning that we're trying to move from the interaction back to the identity. So we're going to sort something out of this. And what we're doing when we're adding this little bit of consideration is modifying it. And there are two ways that you can modify things. And in this case, we're trying to modify it by sorting something out. So we're essentially decreasing our consideration, and that's going to be referred to something as a deferral. One modifier that you can use is a deferral. And that's sort of the negative modifier, meaning that you're just putting you're changing the weight of one of these considerations. It's like a special case or something. You're considering that plus the fact that there's some other thing going on with it, and that will change our supersocial interaction from being 54 characteristics to 53 characteristics. And that's sort of the definition of our deferral, is that we're considering something in a different way, and in that we're sort of modifying how each of those are decidedly considered. So the other thing you can do is modify it in the opposite way. So you can take one of these and you can add something to it rather than trying to sort it out. You can add that aspect into it, and in that sense, we're trying to get closer to our orientation, and that's referred to as a directive. And that would take it from 54 characteristics to 55 characteristics. And in reality, there are only a certain number of times that you can add these modifiers before you kind of break the need to group and sort them. If you add enough of these modifiers to a single idea, it's more likely that it's going to affect how you group and sort them. It's going to change the weight of each one of those things. And in reality, you can only add, total, even if you add them different ones, because of the limits of what standard theory explains, the kind of physical processes and limits of impulse and so on. There are only a certain number of times that you can add a directive or a deferral, and it doesn't have to be at the interaction, but that's the time where it seems to make the most sense. You can also do it at the supersocial identity. So if you have two deferrals here, that would change it from 27 to 25. If you had two directives here, it would change it from 27 to 29. If you had one directive here, it would change from 27 to 28. And the thing that is really important is composing and decomposing them. So if you decompose this deferral, if you keep going, you'll end up with a cycle characteristic of 8. If you keep decomposing this directive, you'll end up with a cycle characteristic of either 1 or 10, depending. So that's just another way to consider how to weigh your options, essentially. And that is another way to facilitate the grouping and sorting. So whenever you truly group and truly sort something, you're going to move from the identity to interaction, or interaction orientation, or orientation to interaction, and so on. But when you add a directive or deferral, you're staying within that specific hotspot, or within that specific area. You're just sort of putting a bias or a weight on one or more of them. So those are the ways that you can modify them without necessarily moving from one to the other. And that more or less describes the dynamic of supersocial communication. And that's essentially the communication of many to many. It's the group communication. It's the way that you essentially participate in what's going on with many ideas happening. And I guess that's another way to think about the directive and deferral, is that you agree with one thing while you don't agree with the other thing. A directive would be something you kind of agree with. A deferral is something that you're trying to ignore or prevent from being considered. And that is sort of how you can participate in the group and sort of provide your insight or what have you to the way that these decisions are made. And the other thing to really keep in mind is the gap. Anytime that you don't have one of these predetermined rules, or there's not really a set of things happening, or if there's otherwise just too much information going on, the brain will have a very tough time reconciling how this pattern should be handled. Whether you should make the connection between this one and this one, or this one and that one, or that one and this one. So that leads to sort of another overload, which is another limit. So with that, what we can do is take another really quick overview over the R scale, and after we go through the R scale, we can move on to the Z scale. So just to go over this one more time, we have three-party shared intimacy, which is the simplest case of realizing that there are too many things going on. And then we have supersocial identity, where we initially compare those three identities. We have the interaction, where we try to group them and determine which ones are more closely related. And then we have the supersocial orientation, where we use some kind of rule or some kind of alternate explanation to describe this pattern without having to try to solve the problem emergently. And if you don't have one of these kind of fail-safes, or one of these rules or something going on, then you'll hit the gap. So we have the supersocial identity, the supersocial interaction, supersocial orientation, and if you go beyond the orientation, you end up hitting the limit, which is also known as the gap. And the simplest case is sort of right in between orthogonal thinking and absolute thinking, is the case of three-party shared intimacy. And finally, along with all these, We also have the modifiers, which are the deferral, which is sort of ignoring or not agreeing with something, and then the directive, which is considering something or agreeing with something or applying additional weight to one of the groups that's being solved for. So now we can go back through the R scale, and we'll go all the way from the beginning with our unit of communication. We have impulse, we have subtraction, we have compression. That's what defines our cycle of communication. Then we have all the prerequisites to accessing the R scale. Then in the R scale, we have our three thinking types. We have horizontal thinking, we have orthogonal thinking, and absolute thinking. Within those, we have all of our communication types, which are silent communication, intimate communication, social communication, and then the next thinking type over, we have shared communication, and then the next thinking type over, we have supersocial communication. So that is what leads us to the gap, which is a limit of intelligence. That's as far as we can go. That's kind of our maximum consideration. And here we have characteristics 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 8, 7. We have the range between 10 and 17 here. And then we have 25, 27, 54, and 117. And that's sort of what pushes us into the gap. So that is the scale of intelligence. That's all we can do in the standard sense, and anything that deviates from that can be considered to be abnormal. And that's something that is best discussed when we sort of switch gears and start talking about what happens at each individual characteristic when something non-standard or abnormal happens, or when you go out of order, or something like that. So now that we've talked about the Z0 scale, now that we've talked about the entirety of the R scale, we've mentioned the gap, we're going to assume that we've gone past the gap, and we get to this bit here, which is the Z scale, which is post-intelligent impulse, and it's also just generally considered vertical thinking, the same way you can sort of interchange horizontal thinking with the R scale. You can think of the Z scale as being part of vertical thinking, or you can also consider it post-intelligent impulse or post-cognition. But now we can talk about the different areas of the Z scale and the different communication types, and sort of define each aspect and the ranges of that.